becoming a thing of the past, because companies and people and entrepreneurs are always going to find the cheapest sourcing. And as technology makes it possible to, for their distance to not be a deterrent, and laws not to be to a deterrent, they'll continue to find the cheapest possible source. And this is what supply chain looks for all the time. So in some ways, the world is becoming crisscrossed with assembly lines. We no longer talk about goods like economists do, or products. They're all what I would call global composites. That's a mouthful, but that's really what they are. Everything, whether the coat I'm wearing, the pen I use, the watch I wear, the car I drive, is a composite. It's made up of parts sourced from very many parts of the world, packaged somewhere else, sold again to all parts of the world. Right? So globalization has also morphed over the centuries to what you would call globalization, where you localize a global product. Right? Because people realized in the early stages of globalization that selling the same thing without culturally adjusting it or accommodating for local tastes is a disaster. Right? So the idea that Hindustan Lever packaged its product differently to sell in the Indian market, or car companies started to do simple things like put the steering wheel on the other side so they could sell it in British colonies. Simple things to globalize a product, and now we take for granted how to globalize it and customize it for the local product, right? So this trend of trade, technology, and globalization has been going on since Smith wrote about it in the first revolution. The second revolution with the electricity invention and the automobile, which is around 1870s to 1910, that's the second major phase. The third transformation that we are witnessing started in the 1950s, 60s, and just exploded in the last 15 years. And this is the phase that we don't know where it's going to end. At the same time, the emphasis has not changed. At some fundamental level, economic forces have not changed. There is still a premium in competition. There is still a premium in productivity. I always say that capitalism, which is where we are, the system we are witnessing right now, with the demise of Soviet-style socialism, puts an enormous premium on productive use of resources. And any resource that is not productive is rendered unemployable. So as I said, there is an enormous tension that's building at the individual level and at the country level between what I called earlier, individuals wanting to spread their wings, companies wanting to spread their wings and transcend national boundaries, and individuals wanting to stay rooted. So this tension between the wings and roots is the way I think about it, because we want to live in communities, we want to live in neighborhoods, we want to have friends, we want to have family, we want to put our kids through school, we have to pay local taxes, we have to elect local elections. But in many parts of our lives, we are completely global, and many people work on different time zones. Their bosses and their companies exist in another time zone, and they're working here, right? So this tension, we don't quite know how it's going to play out. And it's still playing itself out in terms of how do you be assessed for taxes, how do you be assessed for residency, domicile. That our laws are still catching up, because the technology and the global forces have outstripped our ability to manage some of these things, and we'll find a way to it. We always do. It is just playing catch up right now, because the economic forces and technological forces have clearly, aided by the technology, have outstripped our ability to contain and constrict ourselves to say we are all residents and citizens of this particular domestic entity, or a state, or a province, or a country. And at the same time, in survey after survey that's done, people don't want to be global. They want to be rooted for other reasons, other non-economic reasons. They want to be rooted in some community, some neighborhood, some city, some state, some country. Right? So we don't want world government, we don't want world society. We want to be Indians, we want to be Tamils, we want to be. So this is the interesting tension, and it was not new. It's been with us all the time, except in the last 300 years. It is sort of like putting things in turbo speed, and now we are having to articulate how we react to it very, very fast. Because technology has now worked in tandem with trade. So when I used to study earlier textbooks on trade, written around the 18th century, and have my students read it, trade was very simple. As I said, goods got produced in a country, put on a ship, and then you waited for 6 months before the ship went somewhere else, and then the trade happened, and then the reverse. That was trade. Now, There are so many instances where all I do is hit an enter key and trade has been done. So this is the speed of 24/7 connectivity that we're talking about, that international trade is not just the physical movement of goods and services. It used to be just goods. Then it got expanded to services. But now it also oversees transmission of data, information, as what we'll call trade. The one point on which economists still have not reached agreement is the trade in currency, or the trade in financial assets. Right? There's a bit of a disagreement among the profession, because in survey after survey that was done by the American Economics Association, economists generally agree. It didn't matter whether you're a Marxist or a capitalist. They generally agreed with Adam Smith's original contention that trade or openness was good for an economy in terms of productivity, in terms of how it expanded the wealth of the country. The moment we started trading currency, or the moment we started trading financial assets, there's been a bit of a disagreement in the profession itself. So we don't quite have a complete consensus on whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, partly because of my comment earlier that money has a particular attribute to it that goods and services don't. You know, whether it's the principle of volatility, whether it's herding, or whether it's the speed at which money can leave. So you can see why even now, for instance, the Indian economy doesn't have the currency convertible on the capital account. It's only partially convertible, right? Because you worry about capital flight. You worry about the value of currency traded in a given day is more than the value of all goods traded physically in a given year. So just the quantum we are talking about makes people a bit nervous, and that's why there are countries that put what are called circuit breakers to prevent money from coming in and out very fast because of the impact it leaves. This is to be distinguished from what you would call foreign direct investment, where a company comes and says, I'm going to set up a factory, create jobs, and eventually I might take the money back, and that too I have to subject myself to some repatriation laws, but I'm not going to switch money in and out at the drop of a hat. Right? So there is a disagreement, and then we can come back to this if you have a question and answer period. But generally internationalism, which has referred to the free mobility of goods, services, data, information, assets, is what has started since the 17th century and has just kept ramping up more and more. It doesn't mean that if you look at the last 300 years, the entire regime of openness has been one smooth ride. There have been time and again people have wanted to close the borders. There's always forces wanting to close the borders, and then more and more people say, no, openness creates more jobs, creates more wealth, and this tension has always prevailed. So we just finished coming out of one of the most major recessions in 2008. And people often wondered if I was giving this lecture in the September, October of 2008, when major investment banks in US collapsed. We looked like we were heading into another Great Depression. And especially when companies like Satyam went under in India, it really looked like this was going to be a global depression of some kind. Even though in many ways the last 4 or 5 years have not been completely without problems, it is an absolute amazing story that we didn't fall into another Great Depression, right? And there's quite a bit of interesting commentary on why we didn't. Why is it that that period of the financial crisis of 2008 is called the Great Recession, and the Great Depression is still referred to as a period from 1929 to 1933? Let me offer 3 explanations, and you can think about this, what you think about how true or not. The parallels are very similar. In 1929, the US had a stock market crisis and led to a banking crisis. So there's a loss in confidence of the banking sector. But most economists agree that what made it truly a global depression and not remain as an American depression was the next thing that I'm going to say. In 1931, there were 2 American congressmen by the name of Smoot and Hawley who passed maybe one of the most prohibitive and ridiculous acts of import taxation in the history of mankind, called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Because their argument was, despite 2 centuries of economic policy thinking, that the US should protect itself. Which seems reasonable, that's what politicians get to do. They protect, that's what they're elected to do. But they said, let's impose very high import taxes. Because then any product coming into my country will pay a very high tax. And I want to keep the wealth American and keep the jobs American. What Smoot and Hawley managed to convince the US Congress was to pass the tariff. So it's not just them because everybody else has to blame, because they also passed the legislation. And now most economic historians agree that what made it a truly global depression was this particular incident. So how did this play out? If you look at world trade statistics from 1929, 1931, and then 1933, 1935, it looks like an amazing spider web, right? It literally goes like this. So it starts very high because people are still trading. But then when the Smoot-Hawley tariff went into effect, what people forget is that trade is a two-way street. So when the Americans levied huge import taxes, it didn't take much effort for other countries to play retaliation tit-for-tat strategy. And they started levying import taxes on American goods. And the world trade shrunk to this much. It shrank from $3,000 million, which is a lot of money, to 900 million. Right? Think about the shrinkage of the global economy in 4 years.